The palace did not tremble because a document was found. It trembled because Queen Camilla refused to do her duty after solicitors uncovered sealed Elizabeth files naming Princess Anne as the trusted royal figure for a sensitive constitutional handover. In one private hour, grief became power, loyalty became accusation, and King Charles was forced to face a truth hidden inside his mother's final files. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move when the solicitor reached Anne's name. She sat with her hands locked together, her expression held still by pride, but something in her eyes changed the moment the room understood what had been uncovered. The sealed Elizabeth files were private papers left behind by the late Queen, documents meant to guide the royal household during sensitive moments when duty, discipline, and family loyalty might collide. And now those papers had named Anne, not the Queen consort, as the trusted royal figure to oversee a duty tied to palace continuity and household authority. Charles felt the room turn colder before anyone dared speak. He knew why this mattered. A constitutional handover meant a formal transfer of responsibility within the royal system, and even when it did not change the throne itself, it could change who held influence behind closed doors. Camilla had been expected to stand beside him that day for an important royal duty, a sign of unity, stability, and shared purpose. But after the solicitor finished reading, she quietly refused to attend. Not later, not after discussion. Right there, with the file still open, the silence hurt more than anger. Camilla looked at Charles, waiting for him to defend her, waiting for the king to say that Elizabeth's final files had misunderstood the woman he had chosen to place beside him. But Charles hesitated. He placed one hand over the folder, almost as if he could stop the truth from moving any farther across the table. That gesture cut through her harder than any sentence. She saw his conflict, she saw his grief, and she saw that his loyalty to his mother's written wishes had already begun to outweigh his need to protect her pride. Anne remained still, and that stillness made the room uneasy. She did not look victorious. She did not reach for power. Yet the files had done what no speech ever could. They had placed her at the center of judgment, restraint, and family discipline, the very qualities Elizabeth seemed to believe would be needed when emotion threatened the crown. A courtier standing near the wall watched Charles's face tighten and understood the danger immediately. This was no longer a private embarrassment. This was a royal fault line opening in real time. Camilla finally rose, not loudly, not wildly, but with the cold certainty of someone who felt diminished before the whole room. Her refusal sent panic through the household, because everyone knew the duty could not simply disappear. Someone would step into the space she left behind. And as Camilla withdrew from duty, every eye turned toward the people Elizabeth had left behind to carry the burden of her final instructions. Behind the palace doors, this was not only a legal discovery, it was a family wound reopening under the weight of duty. Charles stood between wife and mother. Camilla stood between pride and humiliation. Anne stood between obedience and exposure. William watched the room with the caution of a future king, knowing that one wrong word could turn private pain into public rupture. Charles knew the silence had already become dangerous. The king had spent his life learning how to survive difficult rooms, but this one carried a pain no crown could soften. On one side stood Camilla, his wife, wounded by the discovery that Elizabeth's final written judgment had not placed the deepest trust in her hands. On the other side stood the memory of his mother, whose files now spoke with a force no one in that room could easily dismiss. Charles wanted to protect the Queen consort, yet he also understood that ignoring the late monarch's instructions would make the entire household question whether duty still came before personal loyalty. Camilla felt the blow before anyone explained it fully. Her refusal had not been born from simple anger. It came from humiliation. From the sharp realization that Anne's name had been read aloud before solicitors, courtiers, and Charles himself, while her own place seemed to shrink in the room. She had spent years standing beside the king, enduring judgment, criticism, and cold acceptance. Yet in this private moment, Elizabeth's files seemed to separate ceremonial rank from trusted authority, meaning that a person could stand near the throne without being trusted with every responsibility behind it. That truth cut deep. Anne did not claim the moment. That made it worse. She sat with the kind of control that unsettled everyone, because it carried no surprise, no visible shock, no rush to defend herself. The Princess Royal had become the unexpected center of authority, not through ambition, but because the late Queen's files had placed responsibility directly into her hands. Anne understood that authority in this family was never only about titles. It was about restraint when emotion rose, discipline when pride was injured, and the courage to hold the line even when the person wounded by it sat only a few feet away. William watched his father search for words, and the prince felt the future pressing against his chest. He saw Charles trying to speak gently enough not to break Camilla further, yet firmly enough to honor the crown. That balance was almost impossible. The future king knew the danger was not only the refusal itself, but what the refusal revealed. Elizabeth had drawn a quiet boundary around certain duties, and that boundary now stood between the queen consort and Anne like an invisible wall. Camilla looked at Anne again, waiting for some sign of discomfort, some flicker that proved this had shocked her too. But Anne's stillness carried its own terrible message. It made the room wonder what she had known before that morning, and what Elizabeth had told her when no one else was listening. As the family absorbed the meaning of the files, one old moment began to surface, the forgotten trigger that had made Elizabeth write those instructions in the first place. But to understand why Elizabeth chose Anne, the palace had to look backward, to the single incident that changed everything. Every royal crisis has a beginning, but this one had a trigger. It was not gossip, not jealousy, and not a vague palace chill. It was the night of the Windsor Register incident, when Elizabeth witnessed a private boundary being crossed, watched Anne intervene without hesitation, and quietly understood who could be trusted when the monarchy needed discipline more than comfort. Elizabeth had seen many difficult moments inside her family, but this one stayed with her because it touched something deeper than manners. Years earlier, during a private Windsor ceremony, Camilla's aides attempted to add a household access request to the Windsor Register without the monarch's direct approval. The Windsor Register was the palace's formal record of permissions, roles, and access linked to royal spaces, and in simple terms, it showed who had been granted authority to enter, act, or represent certain parts of royal life. That was why the attempt mattered. It was not just a line on a page, it was a quiet push toward influence. Camilla did not see it that way at first. She believed the request was practical, even necessary, and when the process was halted, embarrassment burned beneath her calm expression. The queen consort had spent years trying to prove she belonged within the family, and the correction made her feel as if the palace still saw her as someone standing outside the final circle of trust. To Camilla, it felt personal. To Elizabeth, it looked dangerous. That difference became the seed of everything that followed. Anne understood the danger immediately. She stepped in before the request could move forward, closed the register with controlled firmness, and told the aide that no royal authority could be assumed without the monarch's consent. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice, because she did not need to. Her authority came from certainty. In that instant, Anne protected more than a rule. She protected the invisible line between support and control, between presence and power, between being near the crown and acting in its name. Elizabeth watched Anne carefully after that. The Queen did not reprimand her daughter. She did not soften the moment for Camilla. Instead, she asked Anne to remain behind after the room emptied, and that private conversation became the hidden beginning of the sealed files. The monarch had seen something she could not ignore. Anne could hold a boundary without turning it into a spectacle. She could act firmly without feeding pride. She could disappoint someone and still protect the institution. Camilla carried the sting of that night far longer than anyone admitted. Anne carried the burden of what Elizabeth had quietly seen, and before the evening ended, The Queen made private notes describing her daughter as steady under pressure and resistant to emotional manipulation. Those words would not matter for years. They would sit unseen, sealed and waiting. But when solicitors finally reopened the files, the Windsor Register incident returned, like a hidden verdict, waiting to be read aloud. And once that old wound was exposed, the present crisis moved from legal discovery to family confrontation. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a chair scraping softly against the floor. Camilla rose before Charles could finish speaking, her refusal already written across her face. Anne remained seated. William watched the space between them tighten. In that room, every royal title fell away, and what remained was a family divided by one dead queen's final judgment. Camilla had heard enough. The solicitors had explained the instruction with careful voices, but careful words could not hide what the files had done. Anne had been named to oversee the sensitive duty tied to Elizabeth's final wishes, and that meant the Princess Royal now held authority in a place where the Queen Consort had expected to stand beside the king without question. The duty itself was more than an appearance. It was a public sign of order after a private decision. A moment meant to show the royal household still moved as one body. If Camilla refused, the wound would not stay hidden. Charles understood that danger immediately. He asked Camilla to continue with the scheduled royal appearance, not because he wanted to dismiss her pain, but because he knew the monarchy could not afford a visible fracture. The king lowered his voice, trying to reach the wife behind the anger, trying to remind her that one bitter hour should not become a public crisis. Yet every gentle word sounded to Camilla like surrender. She did not hear protection. She heard Charles choosing Elizabeth's written judgment over the woman sitting in front of him. Anne finally spoke, and the room shifted. She said Elizabeth's instruction had never been designed as an insult, but as protection for the crown. The crown meant more than the person wearing it. It meant the whole system of duty, trust, and public confidence that kept the monarchy standing through scandal and grief. Anne's words were calm, but calmness only sharpened their impact. Camilla turned toward her with wounded fury and accused her of waiting years for this moment. As if the Windsor Register incident had been a seed Anne had watered in silence. William stepped forward before the accusation could become something impossible to repair. The prince had remained controlled, but he could see the explosion forming in every pause. He looked first at Camilla, then at Anne, then at Charles, and chose his words with the care of someone who knew history sometimes turns on a single sentence. He did not defend the insult. He defended the boundary. That choice revealed where the future was leaning. Camilla's refusal hardened. She said she would not stand beside Charles, while Anne carried the authority Elizabeth had denied her. The king tried once more, asking her not to make the monarchy pay for a private wound, but the words arrived too late. Camilla saw only humiliation. Anne saw only duty. William saw the next crisis already forming. And Charles, caught between them, finally understood the worst truth of all. The argument had exposed something more dangerous than anger. Real power no longer rested with emotion, but with the mechanism Elizabeth had left behind. As Camilla walked out, the palace machinery began moving around Anne, and Charles realized the decision was no longer his alone. Power inside a palace rarely announces itself. It waits in signatures, instructions, locked files, and the names chosen by a monarch who understood people too well. Elizabeth had not left chaos behind. She had left a structure, and at the center of that structure stood Anne, not triumphant, not smiling, but carrying the terrible weight of being trusted when others were not. Charles remained with the file open before him, but the room no longer belonged to his emotions. The king could feel the weight of his mother's planning in every line, and that weight made him look suddenly older. Elizabeth had created a chain of authority for certain royal household decisions, meaning a clear order of responsibility for who could act when sensitive duties created conflict. Anne's name did not simply appear as a preference. It gave the Princess Royal practical influence over the very duty Camilla had refused, and that influence now stood beyond Charles's personal pain. The solicitor spoke with careful control, but his meaning was devastating. Charles could disagree emotionally. He could feel wounded as a husband. He could believe Camilla had been treated harshly by the shadow of a woman no longer there to explain herself. Yet the written instructions carried enormous palace weight, because they came from Elizabeth's own sealed files. And inside the monarchy, a final written wish from a sovereign could not be pushed aside without consequence. The crown demanded obedience, even when the heart resisted. Anne understood that truth better than anyone, and that made her sadness harder to see. She did not smile. She did not reach for the folder. She simply listened, while Elizabeth's words placed her between her brother and his wife. The Princess Royal knew Camilla would see the decision as victory, but to Anne, it felt like a burden shaped like trust. Her mother had chosen her because she believed Anne could protect royal continuity, the steady survival of duties and decisions beyond any single argument. That trust was an honor, but it was also a knife. Charles looked toward Anne, and for a moment, the king seemed to understand the cost carried by both women. Camilla had lost face. Anne had lost peace. Elizabeth's files contained language that emphasized judgment, restraint, and protection, and those qualities were tied directly to her daughter with painful clarity. It suggested that the late monarch had not been acting out of coldness. She had been preparing for the exact kind of emotional pressure now unfolding before them. Then the solicitor mentioned the second envelope. The room tightened around those words. This envelope was marked for release, only if the first instruction was challenged, and suddenly, Camilla's refusal no longer seemed like the end of the matter. It seemed like the key that might unlock something even sharper. Charles did not ask for it to be opened. Anne did not either. But everyone understood the shadow it cast, and while the second envelope remained sealed, the first consequences of Camilla's refusal began to spread through the palace corridors. The absence was louder than any speech. A place had been prepared. A schedule had been printed. Staff had been briefed. But Camilla did not appear. In the silence left behind, Charles moved forward with a face carved from restraint. Anne stepped into a role she had not sought, and the palace understood that refusal had become consequence. Charles felt the change before the duty even began. The king knew every person around him had been told to remain calm, but calm could not hide the truth. Camilla's place had been left ready, and now that empty space carried the weight of her decision. A scheduled royal duty was not only a public appearance, it was a signal of unity, a carefully arranged act meant to tell the country that the household was steady, loyal, and unbroken. When Camilla refused to appear, that signal cracked before anyone spoke a word. Anne stepped nearer to Charles, because the palace had no choice. The Princess Royal had not asked to replace anyone, but Elizabeth's files had placed her in the path of responsibility, and Camilla's absence forced that responsibility into the open. Staff moved quickly, changing positions, adjusting instructions, and warning aides that no explanation should be offered beyond a simple schedule adjustment. But silence only made the change feel sharper. Guests sensed it. Courtiers sensed it. William sensed it most of all. William watched two senior aides exchange a look when Anne was handed the briefing folder normally prepared for Camilla. The prince understood the meaning instantly. A briefing folder was more than paper. It contained the order, talking points, duties, and private cues needed to carry out a royal appearance smoothly. For Anne to receive it meant the palace was no longer waiting for Camilla to return to the role. It was already adapting around her refusal. That was the moment consequence became real. Charles entered the duty with control, but the wound followed him. He paused briefly near the place where Camilla should have stood, and the pause said what his voice could not. The king was succeeding in public while suffering in private. He was protecting the crown while feeling the cost of that protection in his own marriage. Anne carried out the responsibility with quiet resolve, yet every steady step she took deepened the queen consort's fear that she had not made a stand. She had created an opening. Camilla sat alone after the door closed behind her. She removed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as if the act could delay the truth settling in. The queen consort had refused duty to defend her pride, but the palace had not stopped without her. It had moved. It had adjusted. It had placed Anne closer to Charles, and carried on. That realization struck harder than the file itself. Charles finished the duty knowing the day had changed something no announcement could repair. Camilla's absence had become a message. Anne's presence had become proof, and William had seen how quickly the monarchy could reorganize when personal pain threatened public order. But the fallout did not end with one empty place. It pushed husband and wife toward a private reckoning no courtier could soften. And when the public duty ended, Charles went to find Camilla alone, knowing the next conversation would decide more than the day's schedule. There were no aides in the room when Charles finally faced Camilla. No solicitors, no courtiers, no careful palace language. Only a husband, a wife, and the shadow of a mother whose files had changed everything. For the first time that day, the crisis stopped sounding constitutional and became painfully human. Charles closed the door himself, and that small act changed the weight of the conversation. The king had spent the day surrounded by instructions, schedules, legal phrases, and controlled explanations, but none of them could speak for him now. Palace management could rearrange duties. Solicitors could read files. Courtiers could protect the message. But no institution could explain to Camilla why Elizabeth's final judgment had cut so deeply, and no advisor could tell Charles how to comfort a wife while obeying a mother. Camilla did not begin with anger. She began with exhaustion. The queen consort admitted that Anne's name in the files had made her feel erased, not because she wanted to seize control, but because she had wanted acceptance. That was the wound beneath everything. She had stood beside Charles through years of public judgment, waiting for the day when the palace would no longer treat her position as conditional. Yet Elizabeth's files had reopened the oldest fear in her heart, that she could wear the title, attend the ceremonies, and still remain outside the deepest circle of trust. Charles heard the pain behind her words, and for a moment, the king seemed less like a monarch than a man cornered by love and legacy. He confessed that Elizabeth's choice had hurt him too. It revealed that his mother had seen weaknesses inside his own household, weaknesses he had preferred to soften, explain, or ignore. That confession mattered because it stripped away the coldness Camilla had imagined. Charles was not standing above the wound, he was inside it with her. Then the hardest sentence came. Charles told Camilla that refusing duty had made the files look justified. He did not say it cruelly, he did not raise his voice, but the words landed harder than accusation, because they carried the terrible force of truth. Camilla had meant to defend her dignity, yet the palace had moved without her. Anne's authority had not weakened. It had become more visible. The queen consort looked away, and for the first time that day, she did not answer quickly. Silence revealed what pride had hidden. Camilla understood that her protest had given Elizabeth's judgment a living example. The files had warned that emotion might threaten duty, and her refusal had allowed that warning to echo through the palace. Charles watched the realization settle over her, and the victory he might have felt never came. There was no triumph in seeing someone you love understand their own mistake. Camilla finally agreed to return publicly, but the decision did not erase what had happened. It only stopped the damage from spreading further inside the household. Charles knew the private fracture had already escaped the room, carried by altered duties, whispered questions, and the empty space that everyone had seen. By morning, the palace could no longer control the story, because the empty place beside Charles had become a national image. The public did not need the full file to understand the message. They saw the absence. They saw Anne step forward. They saw Charles standing where Camilla should have been. By sunrise, the private refusal had become a national symbol, printed in bold letters, debated on television, and whispered outside palace gates by people who sensed the monarchy had shifted. The palace tried to control the damage before the first headlines landed. A short statement described the change as a schedule adjustment, careful enough to sound routine and empty enough to invite suspicion. The statement mattered because royal silence can sometimes protect dignity, but this silence arrived too late. Everyone had already noticed the missing place beside Charles. Everyone had already understood that Anne's sudden closeness to the king was not random. The monarchy had moved in public, and once the public saw movement, no polished sentence could make it disappear. Commentators seized the moment because it carried a meaning larger than one refused duty. They framed it as a rare clash between personal rank and inherited trust, between the title Camilla held and the confidence Elizabeth had placed elsewhere. Rank meant what a person was called in public. Trust meant who was chosen when the doors closed, and real pressure began. That difference now sat at the center of every discussion, and it made the story impossible to reduce to gossip. It was about power. It was about judgment. It was about who Elizabeth believed could hold the line. Camilla watched the coverage from a private sitting room, and each sentence seemed to tighten around her. The Queen Consort had agreed to return publicly, but the world had already judged the absence before seeing the return. When one broadcaster described Anne as Elizabeth's chosen guardian, Camilla visibly shook with the force of it. The phrase did not merely praise Anne. It suggested that the late queen had looked beyond rank, beyond marriage, beyond ceremony, and chosen the person she trusted most when discipline mattered. Charles suffered in a quieter way. The king was shown the morning papers, and one front page stopped him cold. It carried a stark image of him standing beside Anne under the headline, "The Queen's Final Trust." He folded the paper closed before reaching the second column. He could endure criticism of policy. He could survive public tension. But this was different. This had turned his marriage, his mother's files, and his sister's duty into a national judgment. Outside Buckingham Palace, the mood hardened into something unforgettable. A small crowd gathered near the gates, not shouting, not celebrating, just watching, as if the building itself had become the center of a private confession. One woman spoke into a camera and said, "Elizabeth knew exactly who would hold the line." Those words traveled faster than the palace statement, because they said what many people already felt. The reaction forced the family toward a final internal verdict. Camilla's refusal could no longer be treated as one wounded decision. It had become a test of Elizabeth's judgment, and the world believed the test had answered itself. And when the noise outside grew louder, the palace finally reached the only conclusion that could close the wound. In the end, the files did not destroy Camilla. They revealed the boundary she could not cross. They did not crown Anne with glory. They burdened her with responsibility. They did not weaken Charles as king. They forced him to choose duty over comfort. And in that painful choice, Elizabeth's final judgment became clear, complete, and impossible to ignore. Camilla returned to public duty, but she did not return as the same woman who had walked away. The Queen Consort carried herself with control, yet the old sharpness had softened into something quieter. She understood now that rank could place a person beside the throne without opening every locked door behind it. A royal duty was more than an appearance before the public. It was a promise that personal pain would never be allowed to overpower the stability of the crown. That was why her refusal had mattered. It had tested whether pride could interrupt the system Elizabeth had left behind. Charles accepted the decision with a sadness he could not hide. The king knew the palace had confirmed internally that Elizabeth's instructions would stand, and Anne would retain the trusted role named in the files. Those instructions were not casual notes. They were final written directions from a monarch, and inside royal life, such papers carried the weight of duty, memory, and command. Charles could love Camilla and still obey them. He could feel her humiliation and still protect the crown. That was the price of being king. Anne did not treat the outcome as victory. The Princess Royal closed the file quietly and asked that no unnecessary humiliation follow Camilla. That request revealed more than any speech could have done. Anne had not wanted to defeat the Queen Consort. She had wanted to honor Elizabeth without turning obedience into cruelty. In that private act, the reason for her mother's trust became painfully clear. Anne could hold power without displaying it. She could protect a boundary without making a wounded person bleed in public. William saw the lesson with the clarity of someone preparing for his own future. The prince understood that monarchy does not survive through emotion alone. It survives when restraint defeats impulse, when discipline stands stronger than pride, and when duty remains steady, even inside family heartbreak. He had watched Charles suffer, Camilla retreat, and Anne carry a burden she never celebrated. That was the truth Elizabeth had left behind. Camilla's refusal became the moment Elizabeth's hidden judgment was tested in real time. The monarchy chose continuity over comfort, discipline over pride, and duty over personal pain. There was no mystery left by the end, only the hard truth that Elizabeth's final files had named the person she trusted most, and everyone else had to live with what that revealed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.